Andy Stephen Barber, testifying in court, stated that he had worked as an assistant district attorney in Newton, Massachusetts, for 10 years. But that's in the past. Now Andy is here because he believes in the judicial system and wants to uncover the truth. A year ago, the Barber family's life was no different from the lives of thousands of other ordinary families. That was until the fateful day when Ben Rifkin perished. 10 months earlier, Andy woke his 14-year-old son Jacob up for school. It was an ordinary morning. Andy's wife, Lori, returned from her run and made coffee. Jacob was studying for today's test. Lori suggested that the whole family go to Mexico for a vacation. Jacob was not enthusiastic about the idea, but Andy on the other hand was delighted. Jacob walked to school while his parents hurried to work. For Andy, the day began with the usual legal routine. During a break, he received a call that made him worry. Andy asked his secretary to cancel all his appointments for the rest of the day. At school during a chemistry lesson, an alarm sounded. The voice over the loudspeaker announced that Archer School was on lockdown and that all students should stay in their classrooms. The police arrived. Detective Pam Duffy told Andy that one of the students, Benjamin Rifkin, had been found lifeless in a park near the school. Andy was horrified, realizing that it was Jacob's classmate. Without a doubt, this was not an accident but a crime committed with particular cruelty. A woman passerby who discovered Ben left many traces at the crime scene, which could mislead the investigation. Andy received a call from his son, who said that for some reason the school was locked down. Andy didn't want to give the son details, assuring that he and his classmates were safe. It seemed Jacob wanted to tell the father something else, but in the end he changed his mind. Ben's mobile phone was missing, the crime weapon had not yet been found. Lori, who is on the committee of an orphanage, learned from her colleagues that Archer School was locked down. The incident was already being talked about on all channels. Lori immediately called her son. The police are questioning all the residents of the area, but no one saw anything suspicious. Even late into the evening, the police continued their work. The students and teachers at Archer School organized a memorial in honor of late Ben Rifkin. Andy returned home late. The wife hugged him, saying that Jacob and his friend Derek were playing video games upstairs. After talking with the Rifkins, Ben's parents, Andy couldn't compose himself. The only clue at the crime scene was a partial fingerprint, but there were no matches in the database. Lori couldn't comprehend how this could have happened. Derek Yu, whose father came to pick him up, was about to leave. Andy and Lori wanted to talk to their son about what had happened. Jacob said that Ben was not his friend. Many didn't like Ben because he often behaved arrogantly. Seeing that Jacob was okay, the parents decided to leave him alone. They couldn't sleep for a long time, thinking that their son could have been in Ben's place. The Barbers know for sure that they could not have survived such a loss. At night, Andy was haunted by nightmares related to the past. In the morning, Lori drove the son to school. The police continued questioning potential witnesses and collecting evidence. The superiors decided that due to his friendship with the Rifkins, Andy wouldn't be able to remain objective, so it was decided to assign the case to Neil Logaitis. Andy was certain that Neil wanted to use this high-profile case to advance his career. Andy had no intention of giving up the case, believing Neil's approach was wrong. Prosecutor Lynn Canavan decided to give Andy a chance. Pam Duffy had already received consent to take fingerprints from most of the students. Later, they began interrogating Ben's classmates and other children. Everyone unanimously stated that no one from the school could have harmed Ben. A girl named Sarah Grohl asked Andy Barber if he had talked about this with his son Jacob. Andy was sure Sarah asked this for a reason. However, the girl said nothing more and left. In the school corridor, Derek asked Sarah what she had told the police. The girl replied that it didn't concern him. The case made no progress that day. Pam began to suspect that the criminal who had recently been released on parole might be involved. Previously, 36-year-old Leonard Pads had been convicted of a similar crime, albeit less serious. The fact that Leonard lived near the park only reinforced the suspicions. Andy wasn't sure if they should question Leonard. If they were wrong, a lawyer would intervene, complicating the matter. The police still have no substantial evidence. Andy feels the pressure but must keep himself together. A wake was held at the Rifkins' house. Andy and Lori of course attended. Everyone asked Andy if there was any news about the case. Andy couldn't share any details of the investigation and decided it would be best to take his son and leave. When Andy went upstairs to get the son's coat, he found the grieving father in Ben's room. Dan was crying, unable to comprehend who could do such a thing to his son. Only a real monster could do that. Unlike Dan, his wife Joan could not be in Ben's room. Both parents had lost the meaning of life. On the way home in the car, Jacob shared with his father that he thought Ben's classmates' behavior at the funeral was hypocritical. In reality, few of them were genuinely upset. The father and son stopped by a cafe to order something to eat. Andy was simply happy that his son was alive. All evening Andy continued to study the case materials. Even after his wife went to bed, He couldn't stop. Calling Pam, Andy expressed his intention to interrogate Leonard Patz. Suddenly Andy received an anonymous link to several online posts about Ben. Some commentators, including Derek, accused Jacob of the crime. Andy was in complete shock, not knowing how to react. After this, the worried father searched Jacob's room while he slept and found a hunting knife that could potentially be the crime weapon. Everyone mourns Ben, who passed away too soon. Lori said she didn't feel like going for a run. Andy hadn't slept all night and was about to tell the wife about his find. That same morning, the parents demanded an explanation from their son about where he got the knife. Jacob said he bought it at an army store some time ago. Jacob was already aware of Derek's post and explained it by saying that his friend was a jerk and just wanted to look cool. The parents didn't know what to think. Of course they didn't return the knife to Jacob. When the boy went to school, and he tried to figure out what to do, he and his wife wondered why Derek had posted that. Eventually they concluded that they shouldn't tell anyone about it. Detective Peterson came to Leonard Patz's workplace. Seeing the police officer, Leonard immediately became nervous. The detective was about to ask him a few questions. Andy decided that the right thing to do was to throw the knife away, which he did, but not near the house. A little later he received a call from Lori, who couldn't stop thinking about Derek's comments under the post. Perhaps other parents have already seen this. Andy reassured his wife, saying that there have always been gossipers. Leonard was brought in for questioning. On that fateful morning, Leonard was indeed in the park, but he insisted that he hadn't harmed anyone. The detectives were skeptical since Leonard had previously attacked a guy who looked very much like Ben. However, neither Detective Peterson nor Duffy actually believed Leonard was guilty. Andy insisted that they repeat the interrogation. He wanted to find the culprit as soon as possible. The detectives had no choice but to comply. Leonard repeated that he had been walking in the park that morning but not near the crime scene. He claimed it was just a coincidence. Joanna Klein, Leonard's temporary lawyer, arrived. She was substituting for his attorney just for the day at the colleague's request. Joanna wanted to speak with the client personally, and Andy had no right to prevent her. After those comments, everyone at school looked at Jacob suspiciously. During recess, Sarah approached him and said that Derek was spreading more nasty rumors about him. Since Sarah's friends were waiting for her, the teenagers agreed to talk later. The park was being searched by police and dozens of volunteers, including some students. In the present, Neil Logaitis, the prosecutor, asked Andy why he hadn't participated in the search. Andy replied that, as an assistant district attorney, he had other duties to perform. Andy didn't hide the fact that shortly after the incident, he had found a hunting knife in the son's room and thrown it in the trash, as any parent would. Andy knows his son and doesn't believe he is capable of cruelty. In the past, Dan approached Andy and expressed his outrage over his inaction. Apparently he had also seen the post and comments. Andy called Lynn Canavan, his boss, who asked him to come to the office immediately. Jacob felt like an outcast. Returning home from school and seeing police cars, he quickly walked in the opposite direction. Near the office, 2 officers approached Andy, saying they had orders from the prosecutor to escort him. He realized things were bad. Lynn said they managed to identify the fingerprint on the victim's hoodie. This fingerprint belongs to Jacob. Shocked, Andy believes there must be a reasonable explanation for this. The prosecutor has now requested a search warrant for the barber's house and advised Andy to find a lawyer for his son. Andy tried to convince Lynn that Jacob would come in voluntarily, but she is just following protocol. There is no evidence against Leonard Patz. Andy will be removed from the case and placed on paid leave. Andy can't believe this is actually happening. The worst part is that his rival Neil Logaitis will be handling the case. Leaving the prosecutor's office, Andy immediately tried to call his son. Lori is still unaware of anything, playing with the children at the orphanage. She didn't hear her husband's calls. Later, seeing many missed calls, Lori immediately called Andy back, who told her to go home right away. Finding out it had something to do with their son, Lori panicked. Police were already outside the barber's house. Pam Duffy showed Andy the search warrant. Jacob was nowhere to be found at home, and no one could reach him. Andy didn't interfere with the colleague's work. The experts checked every room for potential evidence and seized Jacob's laptop. Andy waited outside. When Lori arrived, he tried to calm her down. Of course Pam didn't want it to come to this, but she had to do her job. Late in the evening, someone from the search team found a knife in the park. Jacob still hadn't come home. Lori was very worried about the son, but Andy was confident that Jacob was just scared. Andy admitted to his wife that he had thrown away the knife. After finishing the search, Pam asked the barbers to inform if Jacob showed up. She genuinely sympathized with Andy and Lori. When they learned that a potential crime weapon had been found, Andy asked where exactly. Pam couldn't answer because she didn't know any details yet. The police were searching everywhere for Jacob, who was hiding in a playground. Seeing an officer, he didn't run away and voluntarily got into the police car. He was handcuffed. Jacob said he hadn't harmed Ben, but had just found him. The boy got very scared and ran away, for some reason not telling anyone about it. When the Barbers were informed that their son was at the police station, they went there immediately. Neither Andy nor Lori knew what to expect from the near future. At the police station, they were allowed to see their son. Andy asked him to stay calm. Tomorrow the court will set the bail amount, so the parents will be able to take Jacob home. Jacob swore he was innocent. Of course the parents fully believed him. The only thing they didn't understand was why their son hadn't told anyone about finding the body initially. Jacob had no explanation. He was just scared and thought the accusations would fall on him. Before Jacob was taken away, the mother and father hugged him. Lori couldn't hold back and burst into tears. Sarah runs a personal blog dedicated to singing. The Barbers drove home in silence. Lori ignored all calls and messages. Dan and Joan Rifkin were informed that the main suspect in the case was Jacob. Derek's mother was also told about this. Andy and Lori's lives would never be the same. They couldn't help their son, who was now in a cell. Sarah's video recording was interrupted by an incoming message. Andy wanted to say something to the wife but couldn't gather his thoughts. They needed to try to sleep. Leonard Patz sat in a cafe until closing time. No one knows that his phone contains photos of Ben Rifkin, whom he had been following for a long time. Leonard deleted all the photos. In the morning, the Barbers were going to court. Earlier, Andy had spoken on the phone with Joanna Klein and arranged to meet her in the courthouse parking lot. She was the best lawyer in town. Many journalists had gathered outside the courthouse. Joanna would be defending Jacob. She strongly advised the couple to show no emotions at all during the trial. Any reaction could be used against them. Jacob was already being taken to the courthouse. Through the barred window, he saw children boarding a school bus. Joanna also explained to the Barbers that in the eyes of the public, not only Jacob but also his parents were seen as guilty. The slightest sign of anger would confirm people's worst suspicions. As the lawyer advised, the couple kept stone-faced and did not answer the press's questions. This was especially hard for Lori. In the courtroom, Andy exchanged glances with Neil. All the students at school were already aware of Jacob's arrest. The school administration urged students to contact the police immediately if they had any information that could help the investigation. Terrifying images from the past flashed before Andy's eyes. The defendant was brought into the courtroom. Judge Rivera read the charges to the boy. The prosecutor requested a bail amount of $500,000, believing that the risk of the defendant fleeing was high, given the severity of the crime. The defense attorney objected. The judge also did not consider the flight risk to be high and set the bail amount at $10,000. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for August 21st. The Barbers posted the bail immediately. Joanna explained to them how to behave with reporters. Reunited with their son, Lori and Andy hugged him tightly. As they left the courthouse, they were immediately surrounded by journalists. The Barber family became the object of public interest. Lynn felt sorry that Andy had to go through this. Soon she would have to make a statement. Journalists also gathered outside the Barber's house. Jacob was so exhausted that he fell asleep in the car. Later, the parents told him how proud they were of him. Despite his fear, he held up well during the court session. The boy was upset to learn that besides his phone, the police had seized his laptop. The father promised to buy him new ones. The Barbers started receiving anonymous threatening calls. Their life turned into a nightmare. Sarah was doing her homework when she received many messages. She ignored it. Derek, who had already spoken with the prosecutor several times, called her on the video link. Sarah didn't want to talk and dropped the call. Lori couldn't bear what was being said on the news and written in the newspapers about their son. Lori was sure this would haunt Jacob for the rest of his life. Andy decided to confess something to the wife because it would come out soon anyway. It concerned his family, specifically his father. Later, the Barber family met with their lawyer. She explained that under Massachusetts law, teenagers Jacob's age are tried as adults for serious crimes. The parents wondered why their son never told them that Ben bullied him at school. Jacob replied that he was not the only one who had conflicts with Ben. Joanna reassured the couple, stating that fingerprints are usually circumstantial evidence. Often there is a simple explanation for it. Jacob was surprised to learn that his grandfather was in prison for a serious crime. Andy had hidden this from the family because he was ashamed. Jacob asked what his grandfather had done. Andy revealed that his father had taken the life of a woman 17 years ago, and the method of the crime was similar to Ben's case. Joanna assured that Logaitis would not be able to use this information against them. At most it could only tarnish their image. Jacob felt unwell, so he went to the restroom. Lori said she would no longer tolerate lies in their family. She was angry that the husband hadn't told her about his father right away, and that the son hadn't mentioned the conflicts with Ben or the discovery of the body. Later, the family discussed everything that had happened recently. They couldn't even have a snack at a cafe in peace because everyone was staring at them. At night Andy went to the house of Pam, where she had just brought her daughter, whom she sees every 2 weeks. Pam didn't like Andy being there because if it got out, she would be removed from the case. Andy wanted to get his laptop and Leonard Patz's personal file. Andy was sure the police had the wrong person. Pam refused. She and Andy were colleagues but not friends. In the present at the trial, Neil asked Andy to talk about the first days after Jacob's arrest and his relationship with Ben Rifkin. Andy said that Ben sometimes teased Jacob. After being released on bail, Jacob became withdrawn. Since he couldn't attend school yet, the parents hired a tutor for him, Mrs. Mandel. Lori decided to return to work, believing it would help her distract herself. The colleagues at the orphanage management wanted to support her, but Jacob's high-profile case could harm the institution's reputation and affect funding, so Lori was put on indefinite leave. Jacob got into online games and hardly spoke to his parents. The father reminded him not to talk to anyone online during the investigation. Now Jacob had to think carefully before saying or writing anything, as the prosecution could use it against him. Jacob knew he had become famous. He even had a fan page on social media. Andy received a message from Pam, who asked him to check the mailbox. There, Andy found Leonard Patz's personal file. Lori came home upset. She and her husband didn't immediately notice the graffiti on the garage wall, wishing Jacob to burn in hell. Lori hurried to the bathroom and burst into tears. Nothing would ever be the same again. Calming down, Lori went downstairs and hugged the son, while Andy diligently scrubbed the graffiti off the wall. He didn't want the son to see it. In the morning Lori went for a run. She wanted something in her life to remain right. During the run, Lori remembered how many years ago at the bowling alley, Jacob approached another boy from behind, intending to drop a ball on him. Lori managed to stop her son in time. Now in the park, she came across a memorial dedicated to Ben. In the present at the trial, Neil raised the topic of the influence of genetics on behavior. Some time ago, on the advice of their lawyer, the couple consulted Dr. Elizabeth Vogel, who specializes in this field. The purpose of this meeting was to ensure that heredity was not relevant to the case. Dr. Vogel asked the couple what Jacob was like as a child. They responded that he was difficult and constantly cried as an infant. Sometimes this would escalate into tantrums. Jacob would throw things and scream. When asked about his relationships with peers, Lori honestly replied that Jacob could be cruel to others, but Andy denied this, asserting that Jacob was an ordinary child. Of course Lori is convinced of the son's innocence. She just wanted to be honest with the doctor. Toby, an old family friend, came to the barber's house and hugged Lori, saying how sorry she was. Jacob was busy studying all the time. Lori came into the house and started throwing away all the food Toby had brought. It turned out that Gary, Toby's husband, didn't want her to continue associating with the barbers, and Toby wanted to say this in person. The public was still reeling from Ben's demise. Meanwhile, Leonard was extremely pleased with himself and his life. Does he have anything to hide? Sarah Grohl called Detective Duffy and said she had information about Ben's case. Andy made dinner and called for his wife, but she didn't respond or come down. Andy went outside and saw Lori diligently painting over the remnants of the graffiti on the garage wall. The family is going through the most challenging period of their lives. Lori and Andy are trying to cope with it each in their own way. Later, they met again with Joanna, who asked Jacob why he wanted to buy a hunting knife and why Derek blamed him. Jacob replied that he just liked the knife. As for Derek's accusations, Jacob had no answer to that question. Unfortunately, Andy threw the knife away, so they couldn't prove it had nothing to do with the crime weapon. That morning, Jacob went to school his usual route through the park. Before discovering the body, Jacob didn't see or hear anything unusual. Realizing that Ben was not alive, Jacob got scared and ran away. He doesn't know why he didn't call 911 or tell anyone about it. Witnesses, including Derek, claimed that Jacob was in a good mood that morning. Jacob cannot rationally explain his behavior and gets confused in his words. Joanna explained to Jacob that his story has many inconsistencies. If they don't prepare properly, the jury won't believe him. Andy decided it would be better if Jacob didn't testify in court, and the lawyer agreed. Joanna's strategy is to demolish the prosecution's version. This is their defense line. While Lori and Jacob waited in the car, Joanna bluntly told Andy that all the evidence was against them. But she promised to do everything possible to defend Jacob. Andy for his part intends to find something that would link Leonard Patz to the case. Derek, who was quite nervous, was called in for questioning again. While sorting through the mail, Lori found something that made her uneasy. She hid the letter. At dinner, Jacob said he didn't want to pretend anymore that they were a normal family. Lori couldn't hold back her emotions, saying that pretending was the only thing keeping them from going insane. To lighten the mood at the table, Andy made a joke. That evening, the father and son watched an old comedy. Andy was happy to hear the son's genuine laughter, as was Lori. They would have given anything to make this nightmare end for Jacob. Secretly taking the letter, Lori went upstairs and opened the envelope, which contained a document that would later be presented as evidence in court. The newspaper articles about William Barber were sent by a Miss Agnes Martin. There was no point in Andy hiding the fact that his father was in prison for a serious crime. Years ago, newspapers dubbed William Bloody Billy Barber. Andy had a tough childhood. He was very afraid of his father. The past haunts Andy to this day. Lori asked her husband if he ever, even for a second, thought their son was guilty. Andy answered without hesitation no. The next day, he went to the house of Matt McGrath, a victim of Leonard Patz, who years ago accused him of inappropriate actions in the library. Lita, Matt's mother, was open to the conversation. However, Matt was not inclined to talk, insisting that things were not as they were presented in court. When Andy persistently demanded the teenager tell the whole truth, Lita asked the uninvited guest to leave their home. Dr. Vogel conducted a psychological test for Jacob to determine whether he had any violent tendency. The wait made Lori, who was sitting in the hallway, nervous. When Dr. Vogel finished, Lori said they were late for the tutor and had to go. Andy went to the hardware store where Leonard Patz worked. Andy watched Leonard for a long time, and then after his shift, followed him by car. Returning home, Andy was surprised to see Sarah in his son's room. Andy was genuinely glad that not all of Jacob's friends had turned away from him. Lori parked her car near the orphanage where the spring festival was taking place. All this time her husband thought she was at dinner with a friend. On the way home, Lori decided to stop at a diner. A woman who seemed nice approached her. They struck up a casual conversation. The woman introduced herself as Janine. Lori was glad that at least one stranger showed her friendliness and was not against sitting at the table with her new acquaintance. In the evening, the father and son were watching TV and talking. Jacob shared that Sarah thinks Derek is guilty, and by the way he has had a crush on her for a long time. However, Jacob doesn't think Derek is involved. It's still unclear why he spoke badly about him. Lori immediately trusted Janine, and unable to hold back her emotions, opened up to her. All of Lori's friends had turned away from her, so she had no one to talk to. The husband wouldn't understand because he never had close friends. Realizing that the woman in front of her was a journalist from the Boston Globe, Lori quickly left, remembering the lawyer's advice to never talk to the press. At home, Lori couldn't bring herself to tell Andy about what had happened. In secret from his parents and against their prohibition, Jacob decided to create a new Instagram account. Before going to bed, Andy told the wife that he felt their lives were gradually returning to normal. Maybe their son would even have a girlfriend soon. Jacob needed an Instagram account to communicate with Sarah, follow her blog and track his own popularity. Andy decided to tell his wife that Sarah thought Derek might be involved. Right now Andy's main task is to protect his son at any cost, and Joanna will help him with this. In the present at the trial, Neil read out some details about William Barber's case. According to the testimonies, he was a monster incapable of remorse. Neil asked Andy if he had ever feared that Jacob might inherit his grandfather's violent tendencies. Andy replied that he had never thought about it. Having endured a difficult childhood, Andy wanted his son to never feel the same way. In the past, Dr. Vogel subjected Jacob to all the necessary tests, including taking DNA to detect the so-called cruelty gene. A sample was also taken from Andy. This might help them in court. Dr. Vogel insisted that they also take a sample from William for comparison. The problem was that William would agree to this only if his son personally asked him. Andy had no desire to see his father, but for the sake of his son he was willing to do it. Soon Andy was preparing to meet his father in prison. As her husband left in the morning, Lori watched from the window. Meanwhile, Sarah was performing in the school choir. Lori looked at old photos on her phone, thinking that nothing would ever be the same again. Andy was preparing to meet his father, whom he would prefer never to see again. After the choir performance, Joan Rifkin took the stage, and barely holding back her emotions, thanked the school and the parent committee for creating the Benz Fund. Joan also wished all parents to appreciate their children more, after which hurriedly left. Andy arrived at the prison and waited for his father in the visiting room. Finally, after 17 years, they met face to face. William knew he was a bad person, but in his opinion, a son should never turn his back on his father under any circumstances. During this time Andy had never visited him. Andy's mother had passed away from cancer, but he didn't want to talk about it. William didn't know he had a grandson until he heard about it in the news. William was willing to assist his son on the condition that Andy would help secure parole for him using his influential connections. Andy replied that he would never do that. As a result, William refused to help him. Later, Andy discussed this with Joanna. Andy had no doubt that William was just playing with him and had intended to give a DNA sample from the start. Andy received a call from an unknown number, but he ignored it. Joanna showed Andy the latest issue of the Boston Globe, which featured an interview with Lori, even though they had agreed not to contact the press. Lori had to explain herself to the husband. She didn't realize until the last moment that she was talking to a reporter. Sarah visited the barbers again. The girl, by the way, found a part-time job for the summer. The couple was happy that their son had a good friend. In the present at the trial, Neil Logaitis asked Andy if he or his wife had ever doubted Jacob's innocence. Andy replied that they never had. In the past, Lori went shopping at the supermarket. Lately it hadn't brought her any joy, but now she suddenly felt like buying some treats. Lori didn't expect to run into Joan, who took her good mood as mockery. Approaching Lori, Joan spat directly in her face. After that, Lori immediately left the store without shopping. Andy went to the hand-to-hand combat section where Pam was practicing. Andy genuinely didn't want to create problems for his former colleague, but it was important for him to know if Derek was being considered a suspect. Duffy reluctantly said that they had one tip-off, but it didn't check out. Derek had an alibi. His mother drove him to school that morning. Pam couldn't provide any more details. Jacob and Sarah were actively texting. Despite his parents' prohibition, the boy uses social media. Andy was spying on Derek while Lori prepared for an unscheduled meeting with Dr. Vogel. Andy was convinced that Derek was hiding something. Lori wasn't in the best state and didn't even know why she had come. When Lori dropped her things on the floor and started crying, the doctor began to calm her down. Taking a glass lemonade bottle, Andy discreetly punctured the tire of Derek's mother's car. This way the woman couldn't pick up her son from school on time. Taking advantage of this, Andy approached Derek at the bus stop and asked why he posted those messages online. Maybe Derek was trying to deflect attention from himself. Derek hinted to Andy that he didn't know his son well. In reality, Jacob had another, darker side. He watched videos containing cruel scenes online. And he didn't know how to react to what he heard. When Derek's mother arrived, the boy left quickly. Lori decided to tell Dr. Vogel about the incident at the bowling alley when Jacob was 5 years old. Jacob had had strange tendencies since childhood. The scariest part was that his gaze was completely empty at that moment. Lori didn't know why she told the doctor about it. She blamed herself for everything. If Jacob had indeed committed that crime, it was partly her fault too. As a mother, she should have paid attention to the warning signs. Dr. Vogel reassured Lori, saying that in her situation, doubts were normal. Now Lori just wanted to figure things out. Andy went to Sarah's workplace at the ice cream shop and asked if they could talk. During her break, Sarah met Andy nearby. Andy thanked the girl for supporting Jacob. He had already guessed that it was Sarah who called Detective Duffy about Derek. At that moment, Sarah decided to confess something. In fact, Ben's phone hadn't gone missing. It had been with Derek the whole time. Shortly before the fateful day, Ben and Sarah had been texting. When Ben asked Sarah to send her an indecent selfie, she did. The next day, Derek overheard Ben bragging to other guys and told Sarah about it. Moreover, Ben started blackmailing Sarah, threatening to send the selfie to the entire school. Derek, who was in love with Sarah, promised to take care of it and the next day brought her Ben's stolen phone. Sarah got angry and refused to take the phone. This made Derek very angry. 2 days later, Ben was found lifeless. Of course, Andy told the family and the lawyer about everything. It's possible Derek handed Ben's phone over to the police. If it is part of the evidence, they have the right to examine it. Joanna intended to contact Detective Duffy tomorrow and find out. Jacob was upset about Sarah's interaction with Ben. The boy was sure Sarah spent time with him out of guilt. That same evening, in response to Sarah's message, Jacob insulted her. Of course, she guessed what the reason was. Andy thought it would be good for the son to relax, so he suggested they go fishing together. In the present at the trial, Neil asked Andy about his conversation with Derek. Andy replied that he had never caught his son watching any cruel videos. Derek might have lied. In the past, the father and son went fishing while Lori was at home looking through the family photo album. Happy memories brought her to tears. During fishing, Jacob confessed to his father that he was scared. The trial is in 7 weeks and 3 days. The mere thought of prison terrified Jacob. Andy promised his son that he wouldn't let that happen. After fishing, Andy received a call from Joanna and learned that the phone was indeed with the police. She had already filed a motion. There was another piece of news. Andy's father had changed his mind and agreed to provide a DNA sample. Andy thanked Joanna for everything and shared the good news with his son. In the evening, the barbers watched a comedy together. At that moment, they seemed like a completely normal family. Andy guessed that his wife had visited his father to persuade him. Lori did it for their son. William turned out to be not as scary as she had imagined. At night, Andy couldn't sleep. Suddenly he received another call from an unknown number. The first time, Matt didn't dare to say anything and hung up, just like the second time. Matt wanted to do the right thing but couldn't find the courage. In the present at the trial, Neil asked Andy when he got access to Ben's phone. Andy replied that it was 10 days before the trial. In the past, he and Joanna had obtained a court order to retrieve the phone. Of course, Neil didn't like this. Joanna warned him not to try hiding evidence from them again. When Neil made an inappropriate joke about Andy's father, it enraged him. Joanna reassured Andy, saying that sooner or later this fact would have come to light anyway. Pam Duffy provided Joanna and Andy with Ben's phone. They immediately began to study it. Dr. Vogel conducted the final session for Jacob. Lori mentioned that Jacob's birthday is next week. On the way home in the car, Jacob spoke reluctantly. He finds the sessions with Dr. Vogel tiring because she keeps asking the same questions over and over. When Lori asked her son about Sarah, he replied that they were no longer in touch. Jacob didn't want to continue the conversation. There was nothing remarkable on Ben's phone. All the messages, photos, videos and other content were typical for a regular teenager. And he hoped to find answers but never did. Pam Duffy approached upset Andy and said she thought Logitis's behavior was inappropriate. Andy was too exhausted to be angry. Everyone already knew about his father serving a life sentence. Pam understands Andy like no one else. Her brother is also in prison. She also advised Andy not to underestimate Neil because he is confident in his victory. Joanna learned from her assistant, whose daughter is Jacob's age, that the boy is using social media again. At home, Andy yelled at his son, who not only secretly created an Instagram account but also put up a profile picture of himself holding an axe. Jacob justified it by saying it was just a joke, but Andy knew for sure that this would be used against them in court. It looks like an admission of guilt and the fact that Jacob is a psychopath. Of course the boy deleted the account, but that doesn't mean the photo disappeared from the internet. Andy just wants to protect his son, while it seems Jacob doesn't realize the seriousness of the situation. Or Jacob just got over it. In prison, William saw the news about himself and his grandson, who is accused of a heinous crime. Everyone is wondering if there will be a family reunion behind bars. It's being talked about and written everywhere, but neither Andy nor Lori can do anything about it. While taking out the trash, Andy noticed a suspicious car nearby and told his wife about it. When they went outside together, the car was already gone. Maybe Andy was just being paranoid. At night, his phone received another call from an unknown number, and this time the caller spoke. That same night, Andy and Matt met at a cafe. When Andy asked the guy if he had come to his house in a dark blue car, Matt didn't understand what he was talking about. Suddenly Matt declared that Jacob was innocent. The next day, Matt was interrogated in the presence of his mother. Matt recounted how many years ago Leonard offered to treat him to lunch. The guy agreed because it was free. Leonard tried to seem cool, although Matt immediately realized he was a loser. When Leonard offered something indecent for money, Matt agreed. Since then, they periodically met in different places. When Leonard stopped paying Matt, he reported him to the police in retaliation. Leonard had a new object of interest, someone named Ben. Matt had seen them together once. This information could turn the case around. Both Lynn and Neil understand this. Matt also mentioned that Leonard had a knife. Neil definitely doesn't like this turn of events. Matt assured that Mr. Barber didn't pressure him. Initially Matt didn't want to get involved in this case, but he couldn't get Jacob out of his mind, who might be in prison for nothing. Lynn doesn't know what to think about this story. Neil said he doesn't believe a word, but Lynn ordered a search warrant for Pats's apartment. Jacob is preparing for the upcoming court hearing. And he told the family the good news, Pats is now on the list of suspects. Jacob might not even be tried. And he didn't expect a call from his father. It was difficult for Andy, but he overpowered himself and thanked the father for his help. William just wanted to talk to his son. The police were preparing to search Leonard Pats's apartment, who was asleep on the couch and unaware. He was awakened by a knock on the door. Seeing the detective with a search warrant, Leonard didn't resist. In the morning, Lori went for a run as usual and didn't immediately notice the dark blue Lincoln following her, the same one parked near their house at night. Lori panicked. When she stopped, the car also stopped. Lori rushed to run through the yards. At home, the husband and Detective Duffy were waiting for her. During the search of Leonard's apartment, the police didn't find a knife matching the crime weapon, but Pats remains a suspect. Lori told them about the stalking, but she couldn't see the driver. It might be reporters. Pam asked the couple to call her anytime if someone bothers them. Before leaving, Pam honestly told Andy that the situation is bad. Matt had framed Leonard Pats before. It's possible he decided to do it again. In the present, Neil asked Andy if he really hoped to avoid a trial. Andy replied that he hoped at least to delay it. In the past, he and Pam meticulously studied all the details of the case. With only a few days left before the trial, realizing there would be no delay, Andy started following Leonard and rammed his car. Andy was convinced Leonard was the true culprit. Last week, 4 days before the trial, Jacob turned 15. Even on his birthday he was studying. It helped him distract himself. Meeting with the Barbers and Joanna Klein, Dr. Vogel provided a report stating that Jacob has high intelligence and is almost incapable of empathy. Moreover, He has a genetic predisposition to aggression, like all 3 generations of Barber men, including Andy. However, this is not the same as the cruelty gene. Joanna believes they can use this to their advantage in court. Even if Jacob is found guilty, Dr. Vogel's report will help avoid a life sentence. However, that's not what Lori is worried about right now. She directly asked the doctor if Jacob was capable of such a cruel crime. Andy didn't want to continue this conversation, and the wife accused him of wanting so much to be a normal family all these years that he refused to see the obvious. Lori needs the truth now. Dr. Vogel couldn't bring herself to answer, but it was already clear on her face. Lori doesn't know if she can live with this. Andy suggested they forget everything and celebrate Jacob's birthday at a restaurant. The mood was far from festive. Jacob wanted to know the details of his parents' conversation with Dr. Vogel, but they refused to discuss it. They only told their son that he doesn't have the cruelty gene. This brought Jacob some relief. After dinner, Jacob thanked his parents for the celebration. He was glad to feel like a normal family again, even if just for a short while. Now Jacob feels ready for the upcoming trial on Monday. Seeing the blue Lincoln near their house again, Andy was about to deal with the driver and told his wife to take their son away. The driver, an unfamiliar man, denied that he was watching them. Andy knew the man was lying. He only advised Mr. Barber to protect his family and drove off. After calling Pam and giving her the Lincoln's license plate number, Andy learned that it was a stolen car. Pam promised to organize a patrol of the area. Lori felt extremely tired and went to bed. The son wished her good night. In the present at the trial, Andy said it was over in 2 days. The trial was inevitable, and they all understood that. On the way to the courthouse, they were followed by the press. In the car, both Jacob and his parents remained silent. Once in the past, Andy was Neil's mentor and gave him valuable advice. Neil was very nervous, preparing for his first serious case. Now everything has changed. In the courtroom, Jacob felt anxious. Dan Rifkin gave Andy a look full of hatred. The trial session was declared open. Judge French granted 3 requests from the defense, represented by Joanna Klein. First, Andy Barber would also be allowed to represent the defense. Second, any mention of the defendant's grandfather should not be included in the trial. And third, Matt McGrath and Leonard Patz would be included on the witness list. Neil Logaitis gave his opening statement, claiming that Jacob harbored a grudge against Ben Rifkin for bullying at school and attacked him in the park. Joanna Klein, on the other hand, defended Jacob Barber's innocence. In her view, the investigation jumped to conclusions, and all the evidence from the crime scene was circumstantial. After the hearing, the press immediately surrounded the Barbers as they exited the courthouse. Andy noticed the driver again and reported it to Pam. Detective Duffy quickly identified the driver and ordered him to present his driver's license. The man reluctantly complied. Even at night, reporters stayed at the Barber's house. Despite everything, Jacob missed Sarah and decided to text her. Sarah was glad to see his messages. After a phone call with Pam, Andy told his wife that the driver's name was James O'Leary. He is better known as Father O'Leary and is a former gangster. He was likely hired to intimidate the Barbers. But there's no reason to arrest him yet. At the next hearing, witnesses testified one after another. Detective Peterson was one of the first on the crime scene and spoke of Andy Barber as a professional in his field. As assistant district attorney, he had never made mistakes, so no one was surprised when he was put in charge of the park crime investigation. The first suspect was Leonard Patz, who had been involved in similar crimes before. However, suspicions were lifted from him after Jacob's arrest. Detective Peterson is not convinced of Patz's innocence. After the hearing, Joanna had lunch at the Barber's house. Andy received another call from his father, who asked how the trial was going. Andy didn't want to discuss it. William told his son to prevent Jacob from going to prison by any means necessary because it's a terrible place. Andy hung up and didn't tell his wife about the conversation. When Lori learned that the son had resumed contact with Sarah, she was happy. If Jacob is found not guilty, he will surely be able to return to a normal life. Another hearing took place. Forensic expert Karen Carlson, who testified, expressed the opinion that the attack could have been from behind. At that moment, Lori immediately remembered the incident at the bowling alley. Neil Logaitis presented the jury with a hunting knife similar to the one that Derek said Jacob had. Joanna objected, calling it a cheap trick. The judge sustained the objection, refusing to admit the knife into evidence. The defense's version seemed convincing. Joanna framed it as Jacob had accidentally discovered the body in the woods. At first, Jacob thought Ben was unconscious and started shaking him. That's how Jacob's fingerprints were left on Ben's hoodie. Ms. Carlson confirmed that this was possible. During the break, Lori heard Dan yelling in despair that Jacob would get away with this crime. The lawyer was confident and instilled this confidence in the Barbers. This made Jacob feel at ease. It was time for Pam Duffy to testify. She had to admit that videos containing cruel elements were found on the defendant's laptop. This was unexpected for Lori. When Logitis began asking Duffy leading questions and mentioned Jacob's grandfather, Judge French called the prosecutor and the lawyer to confer. Logitis's behavior was simply outrageous, and the judge issued him a warning. If Neil mentioned William Barber again, the trial would be annulled. The judge asked the jury to disregard the prosecution's last question. In the present, Neil asked Andy if he trusted Ms. Klein. Andy answered that he trusted her implicitly. On the fourth day of the hearings, the penultimate witness Derek Yu was called. Joanna had thoroughly prepared for Derek's cross-examination since he had a possible motive. Before the hearing, Joanna told Andy that Matt, their last witness, had disappeared. His mother didn't know where he was, but his girlfriend had recently posted a photo from Florida. Joanna promised to come up with something. Derek testified against Jacob, saying that on that day, his former friend didn't look worried. It didn't seem like he had found a body in the park that morning before school. Derek also detailed how Ben taunted Jacob, who started carrying a hunting knife to school. When Jacob posted a detailed story of what he did to Ben on a site dedicated to cruelty, Derek made a post on social media. Listening to this, Jacob became nervous. Joanna knew nothing about this story, so she hadn't had the opportunity to review it beforehand. The judge gave the lawyer time to confer with her client. In Joanna's opinion, there was no point in denying that Jacob wrote the story because there was his IP address. When Andy asked if things were bad, Joanna didn't answer, but her expression said it all. Derek read the story aloud. Listening to it, Dan and his wife couldn't hold back their tears. Even though the characters' names were changed, it wasn't hard to guess who the real people were. When Derek finished reading, Joan cried. The story was posted 3 days after the incident. Neither Lori nor Andy were prepared for this. After the hearing, the Barbers sat silently in their car. Jacob said it was just a story. At that moment, Andy directly asked the son if he had taken Ben's life. Jacob answered no. That was enough for Andy. Joanna is trying to figure out how to salvage the defense strategy. Their only chance is to attempt to prove Derek's involvement and convince the jury that he was obsessed with Sarah. To do this, they will have to show the jury her selfie. Jacob is against it, but now no one is going to take his opinion into account. Joanna is doing everything she can, and the Barbers understand this. Sarah is ignoring all incoming messages. Jacob needs to talk to her, but she didn't answer his call. Lori didn't say a word all evening. Andy swore he knew nothing about the story. However, he knew about the son's interest in that site and deliberately hid it from the wife. When Lori stated that she believed Jacob was guilty, Andy couldn't believe his ears. Lori was convinced that the story was a confession, while Andy insisted it was just Jacob's fantasies. Lori was tired of living a lie and denying the obvious. Their son is a monster. Lori would still love him no matter what, but she didn't know how to live with this. Both spouses realized that their marriage was on the verge of falling apart. They would never be a normal family again. In the next scene, we see Leonard Patz crying. He was writing a letter to Mr. and Mrs. Rifkin, confessing that he was the one who took Ben's life. Andy was sleeping on the couch in the living room. Early in the morning he received a call from Joanna, which immediately jolted him awake. Right after that, Andy woke his wife and said that Leonard Patz had voluntarily passed away that night, leaving a confession note. This meant it was all over. Lori couldn't believe it. Just yesterday she was convinced their son was a criminal. Andy reassured his wife, saying it no longer mattered and that Joanna would file a motion to dismiss the trial today. All charges against Jacob were officially dropped. Judge French told the young man he was free to go. At that moment Jacob, like his entire family, felt relieved. They hugged in the courtroom. Lynn gave a brief comment to the press. Neil did not hide his disappointment. Joanna and the Barbers also spoke to the press a little. Of course they would remain objects of interest to journalists for a long time. Andy and Lori sincerely thanked Joanna for her help. They couldn't have managed without her. In the parking lot Dan Rifkin approached them, shouting that Jacob was guilty. Dan was stopped by O'Leary, who turned out to be an old friend of Andy's father. It was William who asked O'Leary to keep an eye on Andy and his family. It seemed that everything ended well. The Barbers were followed by journalists everywhere. Seeing the news on TV, William felt joy. Now his grandson was safe. And only Neil Logitis was not happy. The Barbers tried to continue living a normal life, but it was just a pretense. Their lives were divided into before and after. Seeing his wife looking through a family photo album and crying, Andy asked what was wrong. Lori felt guilty for having believed their son was guilty for a while. Andy said they should forget all of this and start fresh. In court Andy said that they decided to move, but not right away, a little later. One day, the Barbers were having a snack in a cafe and discussing their upcoming trip to Mexico. Toby felt very ashamed for not supporting Lori during the hardest moment. Lynn thanked Andy for his dignified behavior during the trial. Andy intends to resign, even though Lynn tried to dissuade him. Having been on the other side, Andy can no longer continue doing this. By the way, the investigation into Pats's case is already completed. There were some inconsistencies in this case, but everything has been resolved. Opening the trunk of his car to put things in, Andy's gaze lingered on the crowbar, and he remembered James O'Leary. Lori has almost completely recovered from the recent events, while her husband appeared pensive. Soon he visited his father in prison and directly asked if it was his doing. William pretended not to know who Father O'Leary was. However, Andy read the crime scene report from Pats's apartment and knows for sure that the case is not clean. Moreover, Leonard's neighbors said they saw a Lincoln without plates near the house that night. William admitted that O'Leary had threatened Leonard into writing the confession note. Everything was supposed to look like Leonard had decided to voluntarily pass away out of guilt. O'Leary took Leonard's life in his own apartment. William did it to protect his grandson. Andy said it was unnecessary, but William didn't share the son's confidence. Neither of them knows if Jacob is actually guilty, but this possibility can't be ruled out. Now Andy has to choose who to be, an honest man or a good father. William is neither, but Andy has a choice. William was happy to meet his son and get to know him better. William would like to meet his grandson too, although that is unlikely to ever happen. And he doesn't know what to do now. Uncertainty has made him lose his peace of mind. Lori suspects nothing and is simply enjoying their normal life. Before bed, she noticed her husband looked pensive. Andy said he was thinking about their upcoming move in his career. Now Andy wants to leave as soon as possible and put the past behind them. Lori supported her husband in this decision. She believes that from now on, there will be no more secrets in their family. Soon the family went on their long-awaited vacation to Mexico. It was Christmas Eve. Jacob had become a recognizable figure. Many considered him cool. The Barbers had a wonderful time. It was everything they had dreamed of. Jacob spent a lot of time with his new acquaintance, Hope Connors. Andy tried to appear happy, but deep down he knew it was self-deception. Andy still didn't know if his son was involved in Ben's demise. In the present, Neil asked Andy to talk about New Year's Eve. Jacob had asked his parents for permission to attend a beach party with Hope. They didn't mind. Andy and Lori had the chance to be alone together. They had dinner at a restaurant and talked about the past and the future. Despite the nightmare their family had gone through, they had made it through and preserved the marriage. Their love had only grown stronger. When they returned to the hotel, they found their son upset. He didn't seem to like the party very much, and he generally looked distant. The parents didn't press Jacob and wishing him a happy new year, went to their room. The next morning while the Barbers were having breakfast, police officers approached them. They wanted to talk to Jacob because Hope Connors had not returned from the party last night. The family was taken to the police station. In the present at the trial, Andy said that according to Jacob, he and Hope had argued before the party. After that, Jacob supposedly returned to the hotel. The Barbers' passports were taken, and they were instructed not to leave the hotel. The parents believed him, but the police did not. Lori didn't want to believe that this nightmare was happening again. Andy had never told his wife that Leonard Pats was probably not guilty. Waking up in the middle of the night, Lori found that the husband was not beside her. Andy was sitting on the balcony, drinking. He could no longer keep it to himself and confessed to Lori that his father had taken Leonard Pats's life with the help of his friend. Hearing this, Lori was horrified. Now she had no doubt that Jacob was guilty. He could also be involved in Hope's disappearance. Andy asked the crying wife if she wanted him to tell the police everything. Lori couldn't answer, feeling physically ill. That same night, the police found Hope. It turned out that at the party she had met a guy who had put something in her drink. Everyone breathed a sigh of relief, but no one knew what the Barbers were truly feeling. They decided to return home 3 days earlier than planned. Lori didn't want to talk to her husband about Leonard Pats. Perhaps that conversation would never happen. That night, Lori couldn't sleep, remembering Jacob's horrifying story on the website. Lori felt guilty for raising a monster. At home in the USA, they tried to maintain the appearance of a normal life. Jacob continued to study diligently. But Lori could no longer pretend. 2 weeks after their return, the Barbers put their house up for sale. In the present, Neil asks Andy what happened between him and Lori and why she's not here today. Some time before that, Lori went for a late-night walk. Andy was packing, then playing a board game with the son. Jacob asked what was wrong with Mom. Andy said she was just stressed about the move. Lori wanted to do the right thing and went to the Rifkin's house, seeing through the window Joanna drinking wine. At one point she dropped the glass, and picking up the shards cried. Lori couldn't bear to watch any more and ran away. At home, Andy kept packing. He worries about Lori, as does Jacob. Andy sees how every day his wife looks at their son and tries to figure out how to move forward. The next day, Lori was taking the son to the barber. At one point, she gathered the courage to ask Jacob the question that had been haunting her all this time. Andy realized his wife was up to something. Meanwhile, ignoring her husband's calls, she asked the son if he had taken Ben's life. The boy denied it, and the mother shouted that she didn't believe him. At the same time, Lori stepped on the gas, speeding up. Jacob begged his mother to stop the car, but she wasn't going to do it until she heard the truth. They got into an accident. The car's hood was smashed to smithereens. And he kept calling his wife. This happened a month and a half ago. Lori and Jacob ended up in intensive care in critical condition. In the present in court, Andy claimed that his wife simply couldn't handle the driving, but Neil didn't believe him. Before the accident, Lori for some reason called Jacob's former lawyer twice and hung up both times. Andy is willing to do anything to protect the son. Neil tried to convince Andy that he is just a victim in this situation. Now only the truth can set them all free. Andy hasn't changed his mind, stating that it was an accident. Later, he visited his son in the hospital. Jacob's condition remained extremely serious. Andy feels powerless. Lori's condition, however, stabilized. Despite everything, Andy didn't turn away from her. Taking his wife's hand, he said that no charges would be brought against her. Lori deeply regrets her actions. Doctors give no guarantees that Jacob will come out of the coma. The events of the day of the accident are partially erased from Lori's memory. Now both she and Andy want everything to go back to how it was. Andy returned to his empty house. He will continue to be a good father to Jacob and a good husband to Lori. That's the story. Write in the comments if you think Jacob is guilty. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel not to miss more exciting new products. Also, the authors will be pleased if you leave your opinion in the comments.